The King's Choice. You only see my beauty, but you don't know my story. A memoir by Stacey Amawoye, as told to Teresa Laryea. Chapter 4. The Orphan's Cry. Father to the fatherless, defender of widows, this is God, whose dwelling is holy. Psalm 68:5. One day as I was trying to figure out how to get out from under this unfair treatment, I heard someone wailing outside. I rushed out to go and see what was going on and got the shock of my life. The old woman that had provided me with a guarantor stood there wailing at the top of her lungs. By then, a small crowd had begun to form around her as people asked her what was wrong with her. I also curiously drew near to hear what she had to say. Nothing on earth would have prepared me for what was about to happen. Shockingly, I saw her pointing at me as she shouted, "She's a ghost! She's a ghost!" I looked at her incredulously and struggled to make sense of what she was saying. What on earth was this crazy old woman talking about? Then she began to tell her tale, and what a tall tale it was. According to her, she just received a phone call from someone who told her that her sister's daughter had been dead for 2 years, and I was that dead niece of hers who was now standing in front of them in the form of a ghost. I opened my mouth to protest and deny what she was saying, but before I could get a word out, I received a hefty slap on my face. Then suddenly my colleagues descended on me like an avalanche, slapping me in the face and kicking me all over my body. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. This was their chance to unleash all their hatred and envy on me. I heard some of them angrily say as they brutalized me, "Oh yeah, that's why she's so beautiful. If she isn't a ghost, where did she get all that beauty from?" Now I understand that we Africans are generally a superstitious people, but this was ridiculous. How could they believe such nonsense? Some of my colleagues even claimed that I hopped around in the bathroom each time I used it. One bizarre accusation after another continued to be leveled against me until they grabbed me and tossed me into a room and locked me up. They reasoned that I would probably try to vanish if they left me outside. I will never understand how supposedly sane people could reason in such an insane manner. As I lay in agony, bleeding on the floor, confused in tears, I began to think back through my life, from my earliest childhood throughout my junior secondary school until then. If I was a ghost, how did I feel so alive? Was I really a ghost? As crazy as it sounds, I began to believe that I was indeed a ghost, and even became terrified of my own self. It is a miracle that I did not go mentally insane through my ordeal. The next day, the door of the room suddenly flung open and I was roughly ordered to go outside. When I stepped outside, I realized that it was afternoon. There in the open, a crowd of onlookers had gathered, apparently waiting for my arrival. I was forced to my knees and ground garlic and pepper was shoved into my mouth as I was forced to swallow it. This, according to them, was a ritual that would prove whether I was a ghost or a living human being. At that moment, I understood how desperately wicked and callous the human heart could be. Not even my pitiful condition, my swollen face, or my tears could elicit even a tiny bit of compassion in the hearts of any of the women who stood around me. Instead, they all yelled at me to swallow the lethal concoction they had given me. This was just one of many tests they subjected me to, just to prove to them that I was not a ghost. To prove that I was human, I told them where my family lived, so they roughly paraded me throughout the streets of Owoshi, a town in the capital, towards my family house in Bubuashi. As I wept bitterly, I wondered what I had done in my life that was so bad that I deserved this kind of unending torment and humiliation. The crowd continued to hoot at me like I was a thief, all the way to my family compound. Finally, when we got to the house and my family confirmed who I was, and I realized that I was a human being and not a ghost, they took off, one after another, leaving me completely broken. They had proven my family right. No matter how hard I tried to make something of myself, I would never amount to much. I wept as though it was the last thing I would do on earth. I had so many unanswered questions swirling around in my mind. Why had I been given this miserable life to live? Would it ever get any better? Was I under a curse? What was going to become of me? As I wept, I called out for my parents who had never cared for me a single day in my life. For days, I cried all day and all night. Bitterness, rage, and sorrow threatened to swallow me up. It is a wonder I did not lose my sanity. I tried to think of someone in my life that I could go to who would console me, Alas, there was not a single person that I could go to for succor. The life of an orphan is a miserable existence and so full of sorrows that only another orphan can understand. Orphans are incredibly vulnerable, with no support and no defense, and are usually treated like the scum of the earth. I felt like a nobody. I knew that if I were to have dropped dead, no one would have cared or mourned for me. A while after my public humiliation, I heard that my fiancé, who at the time of my ordeal had gone to the UK for a 2-week break, returned and met my absence. He immediately came to look for me, and I told him what they had done to me. He was livid. Though he tried his best to woo me back, I was so traumatized and embarrassed by what had happened that I had lost all interest in him and anything to do with him. No matter how hard I tried, I just could not get over it, so I let him go. Later on, I heard that in anger, he fired all the employees who had been at the restaurant during my ordeal. He packed his bags and went back to live permanently in the UK. So once again, I found myself in the same place I had tried so hard to escape. I was back in Bubiashi, in my great-grandmother's house. After I recovered a bit from my ordeal, I decided to pick up the pieces and move forward. After all, I was still alive, and I needed to make a living somehow. So I set up a table in front of the house, decorated it with empty tins of milk, sugar, and Milo, a chocolate beverage, and began to sell them. By God's grace, I managed to get quite a bit of patronage for my business, but after a while, I felt like doing something different. So I decided to venture into hairdressing. I joined a salon as an apprentice, and in 1 year and 6 months, I was ready to graduate as a qualified hairdresser. I felt confident that life was now going to be so much better. But as usual, just when I felt like things were looking up, it seemed like a demon was sitting nearby, waiting for the least opportunity to trip me up or discourage me. Sadly, I heard that my biological mother had died. I have not spoken much about my mother until now because throughout my life I have only seen her twice, and it was for just a moment at each time. I remember when I was in class 6 in primary school, a young lady came looking for my great-grandmother. She met me at the door and inquired of her, so I took her to her. After a short while, this same lady returned to me and asked me how I was doing, to which I replied that I was okay. She turned around and went to be with my great-grandmother for about 30 minutes, after which she left. It was then that my great-grandmother called me and told me that the lady that just left was my mother. The next time I saw her again was when I was in JSS. One afternoon she came in, and this time she sat outside with my great-grandmother. I just stood at a distance looking at them without saying a word. After a few pleasantries were exchanged, she took off again. I did not hear from her until a few weeks to my graduation as a hairdresser when we were told that she was not feeling well. I made plans to visit her after my graduation, which was 2 weeks away, so that I could get to know her better and ask her some questions about why she had abandoned me. But she decided to die on the day of my graduation. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. I was supposed to celebrate my emancipation, but instead I was thrust headlong into mourning. I did not know that you can mourn a stranger. I mourned the mother I never knew. I grieved that she had never cared for me. I grieved not only because she was dead, but that she took along with her to the grave so many of the answers to the questions I had asked my whole life. And now I would never know. And I knew that I was truly alone in the world. I felt so devastated. So once again I wept as bitterly as I had when I suffered at the hands of the witch hunters. My family prepared for her burial. We had her funeral, and that was the end of it. Now, what was I supposed to do? The night after her burial, I sat under a coconut tree close to my house and sang mournful songs, crying out for the parents I had never known, and asking why they had left me alone in such a strange world. The depth of hopelessness that I felt cannot be described, and since I didn't believe in God, the emptiness I felt was profound. Indeed, without hope in Christ, life is an abyss of hopelessness. I decided that since no one was willing to talk to me about my parents or give me any answers to my background, I would create a new life and identity for myself. So one day, I determined that it was time for the journey into my new life to begin. I thought that it would be a great idea to start my new adventure with the new name, because I figured that my old name had brought me so much bad luck. So I got a bottle of Coca-Cola, emptied it all over my head as a form of baptism, and repeated my new name over and over again. With the sound of the waves crashing on the beach and the leaves of the coconut tree rustling in the wind, I declared my entrance into my new life. When a mother dies too young, something inside her daughter always feels incomplete. There's a missing piece she continues to look for, an emptiness she keeps trying to fill. Hope Edelman.